The unsettling riddle of the lost wagon train in the Appalachian Mountains. Before we dive into tonight's tale, I want to hear from you. Where are you at this moment? At home with the lights turned low, driving along empty roads, perhaps tucked in bed hoping you won't regret hitting play. Drop it in the comments. Where you're tuning in from, what the clock says, and whether you're by yourself, because these tales feel different depending on where they reach you. And knowing you're somewhere out there listening means the world to us. If you're new here, please subscribe and enable notifications. Every story we share deserves the right listener, and I believe you're exactly that. Now, dim the lights, make yourself comfortable, and no matter what, don't respond if something whispers your name. The autumn of 1878 crept through the Ozark Mountains like a weary traveler. Days shortened, and the air carried the faint, metallic scent of winter's approach. In the distance, smoke from wood fires curled lazily into Springfield, Missouri's gray sky. From that restless little town, 12 families gathered their wagons, packed their dreams, and headed west toward a land they believed would offer a fresh start. 43 souls in total, men hardened by frontier life, women who preserved faith in the quiet between peaks, and children who had never seen beyond the Missouri plains. They called themselves the Harrow Creek Settlers. Their leader, Nathaniel Price, was both farmer and preacher, carrying a rifle and a worn Bible at his side. They departed at dawn, their caravan moving slowly along the rutted trail winding through the dense oak ridges of the southern Ozarks. Wheels groaned against stone. Mules snorted through the morning haze. One woman, Margaret Holloway, hummed an old hymn while her daughter clutched a rag doll whose button eyes stared blankly over the wagon's edge. For days, the trail offered nothing eventful. The settlers spoke little. Tired, worn, and humbled by the wild land around them. The forest seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, alive with the wind's sighs through the treetops. Yet more than once, someone noted the silence, the kind that presses against your skin and makes every movement feel like an intrusion. By the 5th day, the usual birdsong had disappeared. That's when Nathaniel began marking their route on the old Confederate officer's map tucked inside his coat. Each night, he knelt by the campfire and drew new trails by firelight, but the lines seemed to loop in circles. The stars didn't match the map. "We're losing our way," muttered Thomas Reed, an olderman tightening his coat against the cold. "The Lord's path is rarely straight," Nathaniel replied, trying to sound certain. Beneath their words, a growing unease lurked, one that faith couldn't easily ease. "The land that doesn't want you," locals had warned. "Don't travel through the southern forks of the White River, especially this late in the year. The ground shifts there," a trapper told them at a Springfield tavern before they left. "Things come and go without leaving tracks." The settlers laughed it off. Folks in the Ozarks are full of myths, stories about hollows where voices travel through the earth, where lantern lights drift like will-o'-the-wisps. Nathaniel dismissed such tales as superstition, but the mountains followed their own laws. On the 8th day, they reached a strangely untouched stretch of ground, a dense corridor of twisted trees with bark charred black as if burned long ago. The air felt stale, carrying the smell of damp stone and iron. That night, the men couldn't keep fires lit. Sparks rose from tinder only to fade, swallowed by unseen moisture. Margaret was the first to whisper, her voice trembling as she held her shawl tight. "The woods are listening." The others laughed nervously. Yet when the children woke screaming the next morning, each claiming to have heard their names whispered from beneath the wagons, no one slept easily again. The circle of wagons. By mid-October, steady rain turned the trail into a bog. Wheels sank halfway with every turn. Nathaniel Price's journal entry described their state: progress slow. Spirits low. One child fevered. "We seek high ground before winter catches us." That night, the caravan reached a narrow clearing ringed by oaks knotted and bent inward, as if dragged by some long, invisible weight. Nathaniel ordered the wagons into a defensive circle, promising they'd move again at dawn. Inside that circle, families lit their final fires. The flickering light showed pale, drawn faces, soaked in exhaustion and fear. Some prayed. Some just sat silently, clutching the hands of those they loved. And as the wind howled through the branches, several claimed to hear something beneath it, a low hum like distant thunder, only coming from underground. "It's a river," someone whispered. "No," Nathaniel muttered, listening. "It's not water." Before dawn, the last fire died. No one would ever see them again. What the trackers found. Weeks later, 2 trappers from Salem stumbled upon the clearing. They followed wagon ruts for miles through dried mud until the tracks suddenly ended. The sight froze their blood. 12 wagons stood in a perfect ring, untouched by wind or rain. Inside, everything remained in place, half-sewn quilts, plates neatly stacked, cups half-filled with rainwater. A child's shoe rested beside a small wooden horse crudely carved from pine. But of the 43 settlers, not one body, footprint, or trace remained. The trappers said it felt wrong to speak loudly there. The clearing had no wind, no birds, not even insects stirring. Later reports claimed one of the men began trembling, unable to explain why the ground beneath his boots felt hollow. They returned to town in silence, refusing to camp until daylight. Within days, the sheriff's men arrived to investigate. They found exactly what the trappers described, and nothing more. The official report documented the scene plainly, concluding, no evidence of foul play. Destination unknown. But the deputy who wrote it later told his wife he'd left out one detail. When they packed the wagons for transport, they found faint marks on the earth, a handprint pressed deep into the dirt near one wagon wheel, far larger than any human's. The silence that followed. Locals named the clearing the Hollow of Silence. Hunters refused to enter. Animals, they said, circled around it rather than crossing its center. At night, strange lights were sometimes seen drifting above the tree-line, greenish and cold, like lanterns through fog. Then the stories began. Old men muttered in taverns that the Harrow Creek settlers had angered something ancient dwelling beneath the Ozarks, an old god, a buried river spirit, or maybe the mountain itself. But those were only whispers, always spoken softly, always followed by silence. The sheriff closed the case within a month. The wagons were burned, the ashes buried. Springfield moved on, but deep in those hills' roots, the story lingered, patient and waiting. And 3 years later, when a fur trapper named Elias Dunmore unearthed a small wooden box beneath a gnarled oak near that same clearing, the writing inside confirmed what locals already feared. He came from the wrong direction, from beneath the earth, and he called us by name. The year was 1881. The Ozark Mountains had frozen over early that winter, sealing the land under a crust of frost that cracked beneath every hoof and boot. For most, it was a season to stay near the hearth, but Elias Dunmore wasn't like most men. He was a trapper by trade, a drifter at heart, and the forest was the only home he trusted. Tall, bony, and silent as a shadow moving through trees, Elias lived by the hunt's rhythm. Born further east in Kentucky before the war, he'd come west chasing beaver pelts and peace. He found neither. Elias didn't believe in stories, not ghost tales, not biblical ones. Yet the locals in nearby Salem Ridge always lowered their voices when speaking of the hollow. Even the toughest men avoided the route cutting through that part of the Ozarks. They said things still listened there. Elias laughed it off, until the night he didn't. A trail gone wrong. It started as a simple trapping run. He'd been checking snares near Dry Creek Basin, about half a day's ride from the vanished caravan's known site. Late afternoon, the forest began to change. The air grew oddly warm. Snow no longer crunched but sagged under his boots, damp and heavy, as if the ground itself were exhaling. A thin mist clung to the hollows between trees. And though it was deep winter, The smell of mud rose thick around him, that wet iron scent of freshly turned earth. When his horse, Clover, stopped and refused to go further, Elias finally noticed the clearing. It wasn't on any map. The trees bent inward, gnarled and heavy with moss. In the center stood a massive oak, its roots twisted like old fingers gripping the frozen ground. The air felt muffled, as if the forest held its breath. Elias approached slowly. The ground beneath the oak was softer than the rest, too soft for frozen soil. His boot sank half an inch, and then came the stench, decay, faint but undeniable. What the earth gave back. He dug with his hunting knife first, then with bare hands. The soil loosened with each thrust until metal struck wood. A small box, no larger than a bread loaf, bound with rusted latches and covered in long cracked pitch. Inside lay dry paper, a journal, by the look of it. The ink had bled in most places, but one entry remained nearly untouched, preserved by wax or providence. The writing was shaky, frantic, as if by a trembling hand. He came from the wrong direction, from beneath the earth, and he called us by name. The words carved into Elias's memory the moment he read them. He blinked, read again, but the letters seemed to deepen the longer he stared, as if the ink wanted to see through the page into him. He snapped the box shut and stumbled back to his horse. Clover was restless, stomping and breathing hard, head jerking toward the tree-line. Then Elias heard it, a low rumbling vibration beneath his feet. Not thunder, not water. Something else. Something moving within the ground. He rode without looking back. Shadows in the cabin. By the time he reached his cabin, the sun had vanished behind the hills, leaving only a faint red of dying daylight. Elias barred the door, lit a lantern, and placed the box on the table beside his empty supper plate. He poured whiskey, then reopened the journal. The handwriting wasn't uniform. Some lines were neat and deliberate, others hurried and barely legible. As if multiple people had written in shifts, recording what they saw before the end. The ground opens at night. We hear him whisper through the roots. Do not answer when he says your name. Then the final page, the one he'd read first, trembled in his hands. For a moment, Elias thought he saw faint dampness spreading at the bottom, as if the ink were fresh. He closed it quickly, heart pounding. Outside, a soft thud came from the porch, then another, something pacing. He grabbed his rifle and moved to the window. The forest outside was black, not shadowed, but utterly devoid of light. Even the full moon barely touched the ground. He listened. A single whisper reached him through the glass, a man's voice, low, calm, almost kind. Elias. The rifle slipped slightly in his hands. You found what was not yours to find. Elias backed away from the window, breathing heavily, his lantern flickering as if starved of air. The whisper came again, not from outside this time, but from beneath the floorboards. Bury it again. Then silence. The fire. By morning, Elias was gone. Neighbors claimed to have seen smoke rising from his cabin before sunrise. When they arrived, they found it burned to cinders. Among the ashes, only the charred iron latches of the wooden box and fragments of two blackened paper remained. The coroner ruled no body recovered, though some insisted they saw boot prints leading from the ruins to the tree-line, single file, as if one man walked into the forest and never returned. In the following weeks, whispers spread through Salem Ridge once more. Hunters spoke of tremors underfoot near Dry Creek. Miners claimed their picks struck hollow earth that vibrated when touched. And one farmer, miles away, swore he heard his child call from the basement long after she'd gone to sleep upstairs. By spring of 1882, Elias Dunmore's mystery had settled like a fog over Salem Ridge. The last snow melted, revealing blackened soil around his cabin's ruins. Locals pretended not to notice the strange sweetness mixed with char that hung there for weeks. Some said it didn't smell like wood at all. Sheriff James Whitlock of Denton County was not a superstitious man. He'd fought in the war, buried friends, and seen death close enough to know its smell. But something about this case refused to rest. Elias's cabin had burned evenly, unnaturally so. The fire hadn't spread beyond the property line, though nearby ground was littered with scorched stones and ashes that shimmered faintly in daylight. Inside the remains, they found his rifle intact, trigger untouched, barrel clean, and next to it, the iron clasps of what had once been a wooden box. That troubled Whitlock most. The box had burned hotter than anything else. A town divided. Salem Ridge was small enough that everyone knew the story within hours. Half the townsfolk claimed Elias had gone mad after years alone in the hills. The others whispered that something had found him, the same thing that found those settlers years ago. The sheriff assembled a team of 3, his deputy, a preacher named Father Abel Morris, and a young surveyor, Thomas Keene, newly hired to chart rail routes through the Ozarks. Together, they rode out to the clearing people now called the Hollow of Silence. "I don't fancy superstition," Whitlock said as they approached, "but every man who's gone looking for answers out here ends up bones and rumor." "Maybe rumor's all the truth we deserve," Father Morris replied softly. The trail was nearly invisible now, swallowed by new growth and weeds. What struck them first was the silence. No birds, no insects, no wind through leaves. The place seemed embalmed in stillness. Then they saw the wagons, the circle that remained. Contrary to Whitlock's expectations, the wagons were still there, half crumbled by time, stripped of iron and rot, but unmistakably arranged in a perfect ring, just as old reports described. Inside one, a few porcelain dishes survived, fused by rust. Another held the remnants of a small cradle, wood blackened but intact enough to recognize its shape. The deputy crossed himself. Father Morris whispered a prayer. Whitlock knelt and ran his hand over one wagon wheel. The bark beneath flaked away, revealing older wood, charred and scarred by heat far greater than weather could cause. "Struck by lightning, maybe," Keene suggested. "Lightning doesn't burn in circles," Whitlock muttered. The young man pointed toward the clearing center. There, beneath layers of moss and soil, was a faint depression, not a crater, not a grave, but something like the outline of a shallow cup, 10 feet wide. Whitlock pushed his boot tip against it. The ground crumbled slightly and gave a low, hollow echo, almost like tapping wood. No one spoke for a long time. The hollow beneath. They began to dig. It took most of the evening, shovels hitting packed mud, roots, and stones. As the sun set behind the trees, the light grew amber and strange, turning the air heavy. Whitlock called to stop, but Keene, driven by curiosity or madness, struck one final blow. The sound that came from beneath wasn't stone. It was a creak, as if something old and rotted had shifted deep below. Then a breath of cold air rose from the hole, damp and fetid, carrying the smell of salt and metal. Father Morris stumbled back, gagging. "Close it," he gasped. "For God's sake, close it now." Whitlock hesitated, the pragmatist at war with the men inside who felt the wrongness in his bones. But he nodded. They buried the hole quickly, stamping down the earth as dusk grayed into shadow. When they turned to leave, Keene was staring past them, eyes wide, face pale. "Sheriff," he whispered, "they're standing there." Whitlock followed his gaze. Between the trees, shadows hung in the mist like silhouettes, faint and still, as if carved from smoke. Too tall to be human, too still to be alive. And when Whitlock blinked, they were gone. The missing surveyor. By the time they made it back to town, night had fully fallen, and none of them spoke. Father Morris resigned within a week, leaving a letter on the church door that simply read, "The ground is not ours." Whitlock filed a brief, factual report, omitting the strange details. But what chilled him came days later, when the telegraph office delivered a note addressed to him, unsigned, but written in fine, deliberate script. He only calls those who hear him. That same night, Thomas Keene failed to return home. His horse was found wandering the next morning, reins dragging, saddle torn. Whitlock ordered a search party. They found nothing but a still-burning campfire where Keene had last set up his tent, and footprints that circled it once, leading away from the fire. Not a trail of movement, but a perfect ring of steps pressed into the dirt, ending exactly where they began. The sheriff didn't go back to the clearing, but he stopped sleeping. By spring, the record that shouldn't exist. Years later, long after Whitlock's death, his journals were discovered sealed within the walls of the old Denton County Courthouse. Among the entries, mostly routine legal matters, there was one dated April 9, 1882, written in a trembling hand. It wasn't a man, it wasn't a creature, it was the land itself. When the whole breathed, I smelled the ocean. There is no ocean here. That entry ended mid-sentence, and in the margins, faintly pressed into the paper long after the ink had dried, a second handwriting appeared, smaller, warped as if burned into the page itself. It remembers the names. By the turn of the century, nearly 2 decades had passed since Sheriff Whitlock's last entry. Salem Ridge had changed. New rail lines brushed its outskirts. Merchants came and went, and even the church Father Morris once tended now stood abandoned, its roof sagging under moss. But one thing never changed. No one built near the hollow. To outsiders, it was mere superstition. To those born in these hills, it was a law older than any written one. The Ballad of the Vanished. Stories have a way of surviving even when the truth dies. In the Ozarks, stories don't just survive, they feed. As children, locals learned the Ballad of the Vanished, passed down from porch to porch on nights when clouds covered the moon. Old women sang it to warn travelers that the mountains eat what walks without asking. One of the earliest versions was collected in 1902 by a folklorist named Clara Kellum, who transcribed it in her notebook. 12 wagons rolled where the map runs blind. 40 souls the hills did bind. They built their circle. They lit their flame. But the earth below them called their name. When Kellum presented the ballad at a lecture in St. Louis, professors nodded politely, amused by backwoods imagination. What they didn't notice, or chose not to, was the tremor in her hand as she turned the pages. 3 weeks later, Kellum's lodgings were found abandoned. All that remained was her field journal open on the desk. The final line read, "It knows the words now." The Miner's Tale. In 1911, a group of miners from Mill Creek accidentally broke through a seam that connected to an uncharted cavern. The air inside was dry, ancient, almost metallic. Deep within, they discovered wagon parts coated in limestone, axles, frames, even a porcelain dish fused into the rock. Convinced they'd found remains of the lost caravan, they hauled some items to the surface for local papers. But before the story could run, the mine collapsed. 2 men died instantly. 3 others were never found. When rescue teams cleared the shaft days later, they reported hearing muffled knocking from below, slow, rhythmic, as if following a heartbeat. But no human voice answered. The mine was sealed permanently within the week. Old-timers swore that at night, you could still feel a faint vibration in the ground near Mill Creek, like someone knocking to be let out. Locals called it the undersong. The coming of the radios. By the 1930s, electricity reached even the remotest Missouri farms, carrying not just light but voices from beyond. With it came static, and static had its own way of singing. During those years, people began reporting strange transmissions late at night along mountain ridges, humming tones, fragments of words, faint choirs with no station attached. Farmers tuning their sets swore they heard names, sometimes of neighbors, sometimes of ancestors long dead. A Little Rock newspaper ran a humorous piece calling it the ghost station. Engineers blamed atmospheric interference, a quirk of mountains reflecting distant signals. But every man who went up the White River Valley to look for the source came back changed, thinner, quieter, or not at all. One repairman, Henry Boyle, left behind a recording etched into a tin disc. It captured nearly 30 seconds of the noise. Modern archivists still argue over whether, buried beneath the static, a sentence can be heard, the ground remembers. The Widow's Letter. In 1954, a widow named Ollie Hutch, one of the last descendants of the Harrow Creek families, wrote a letter to her pastor before dying of pneumonia in a small Ozark nursing home. The letter surfaced decades later during a church archive cleaning. She claimed her grandfather had once traveled to the hollow before it was sealed off and found what he called a door of breath. Every 20 years or so, the soil in that clearing would sink slightly, exhaling a faint mist that smelled like the ocean. "We live atop something that moves slow," Ollie wrote. "It doesn't sleep. It only waits for its name to be spoken again." Her body was buried near Springfield. 2 weeks after her funeral, her grave reportedly cracked open overnight. Not wide, not deep, just separated, as if the earth beneath had shifted with a sigh. What the hills remember. By the late 1970s, the world beyond the Ozarks had forgotten the story. Towns grew, highways carved through valleys, and myths became tourist attractions. But on back porches and at deer camps, whispers persisted. Sometimes people camping near the old ridges heard singing at night, clear, layered voices speaking in a language nobody could place. Deputies who went to check found no music, only patches of ground that seemed freshly turned, though no shovels or tools were ever used. The whisperers never agreed on what they believed. Some said the mountain itself had taken the settlers, swallowed them whole. Others believed something beneath had simply used the ground to reach them. But the oldest men, the ones who remembered their fathers' warning never to cut trees too deep near the hollow, just shook their heads and muttered the same quiet line, "The Ozarks don't forget. They wait." Autumn had come again to the Ozarks, 148 years after the wagon train vanished. The forests looked the same as in those old yellowed sketches, twisted oaks, valleys filled with low mist, and a silence that seemed older than time. Only now the silence was broken by something new, the distant hum of a drone camera, rising through the leaves like an unfamiliar insect. Dr. Miriam Cole, a cultural historian from the University of Arkansas, was not the kind to chase ghosts. She was rational, methodical, a woman who trusted data more than rumor. Yet when she stumbled upon Sheriff Whitlock's journals in the university archives, along with fragments from Elias Dunmore's reported site, her curiosity overcame caution. She called her expedition Field Survey 1878A. Locals still called it the Hollow, the Forgotten Clearing. 3 weeks into her survey, Miriam parked her Jeep along a Forest Service path, carrying only a field recorder, GPS device, and digital camera. The path had nearly vanished beneath ivy and briar, yet she recognized the contours from Whitlock's notes. The closer she came to the site, the quieter the world became. No wind, no birds, even insects faded from the air. When at last she reached the clearing, she understood why every generation since 1878 had avoided it. The trees there still leaned inward, forming a crude ring. Moss clung to their trunks in dark, hand-shaped patches. The soil was strangely pale, like ash, and in the center, faint beneath the grass, lingered a perfect circular depression, 10 paces wide. Miriam lifted her camera. Her voice trembled only slightly as she recorded, October 22, 2026. Coordinates verified. The topography matches the 1882 reports exactly. When she took her first photograph, the camera screen flickered, nothing but white static. Then a faint hum began, low but rhythmic, pulsing under her boots like a heartbeat within the ground. The voices on the tape. That night at her motel in Springfield, she replayed the audio from her digital recorder. Most of it was silence, but beneath that silence ran something deeper, a distorted vibration too even to be natural. When she filtered it through editing software, the waveform revealed subtle rhythmic peaks, a pattern. Then came the faintest sound, human, maybe, but elongated, warped by time. Miriam. She froze. The sound repeated, softer now, almost gentle. Then a different voice, rough, male, barely audible, whispered, "He still calls." Miriam shut the laptop and stared into the mirror for a long time, trying to laugh at her own nerves, but her reflection seemed to blur faintly, as if the glass itself were breathing. And into the ground. She returned to the hollow the next morning with a small team, 2 graduate students and a local guide named Jack Darnell, whose father had once worked the old Mill Creek mine. The students set up sensors and began scanning for subsurface voids. Within an hour, one monitor pinged, a cavity roughly 12 meters below the clearing, extending farther than their instruments could measure. "Could be an old sinkhole," suggested one student. Jack shook his head slowly. "Sinkholes don't hum, miss." As they prepared to take soil samples, the ground shivered, a low rolling vibration followed by the sharp sound of splitting earth. The central depression widened, collapsing inward. One student screamed as the soil gave way beneath the equipment, pulling half their rigging into the hole. When the dust settled, Miriam crawled to the edge. The opening was about 6 feet wide now, a smooth shaft leading down into darkness, and something glimmered below, reflecting faintly like light on wet stone. "Photogrammetry scan," she ordered, steadying her voice. But no skin came through. The devices returned only blank white fields, their sensors overexposed as if staring directly into the sun. And then the whisper came again, this time unmistakable, rising from the hollow, from beneath. One student bolted for the tree lean. Jack followed, firing a flare into the air, but Miriam stayed, too entranced, too close. The voice shifted, flattening into many, hundreds, maybe thousands at once, all overlapping, all calling different names. One of them was hers. The recording. 36 hours later, the search team found the site. Equipment scattered, no bodies, no tracks. The soil perfectly smooth, as if brushed clean. Only Miriam's audio recorder remained, half buried in the ash-colored earth. Its final minutes captured nothing but wind, until from far below came a sound like water rushing through stone. Then faintly, a voice barely above a breath, "We have waited long enough." Moments later, the recording cut to silence, followed by 43 seconds of static. Sound engineers who later analyzed the file claimed hidden within those seconds was a pattern repeating exactly 43 times, the number of settlers who vanished in 1878. The hollow today. Government contractors later declared the site unstable due to subsurface geological shifts. The area was fenced off, access restricted by quiet order. No further investigation permitted. Residents of Salem Ridge no longer speak of it aloud. Satellite imagery shows nothing unusual, just trees, shadows, and a faint circular scar that sometimes appears in drought years, like the ghost of an old wound. But campers along the far ridges tell a different story. On still nights, they say, if you leave any recording device running, it catches a heartbeat beneath the ground, steady, patient, and impossibly deep. And when you play it back, sometimes you can hear a voice whispering softly, almost kindly, "It never stopped calling your name." Epilogue. What was never filed. The following documents were recovered from a sealed archive at the University of Arkansas Special Collections Division in the spring of 2027. Their origin remains disputed. No official agency has claimed authorship. Document I, Internal Memorandum, United States Department of the Interior Office of Land and Resource Management. Classified. Distribution restricted. Date, November 14, 2026. Site closure, Denton County, Missouri. Following the disappearance of Dr. Miriam Cole and 2 graduate assistants at the above-referenced survey location, this office has authorized permanent closure of all access routes within a 2 km radius of GPS coordinates, redacted. Official cause of incident: subsurface geological instability, Class 4 sinkhole event. No further academic or journalistic access will be permitted. All field data collected by Survey Team 1878A has been transferred to federal custody. University staff are reminded of their non-disclosure agreements. This memo does not constitute acknowledgement of any anomalous event. Addendum, handwritten and signed, found attached to original, do not open the ground again. It was listening before we arrived. Document 2, Dr. Miriam Cole's final field notes, recovered audio transcript. Digital recorder last active, October 23, 2026, 6:47 a.m. The following was transcribed from audio. Background noise consistent with wind and low-frequency ground vibration throughout. I need to document this before I lose clarity. The cavity below the clearing is not geological. The walls are smooth, not carved, not natural erosion. Smooth like something wore them down from the inside over centuries. The pattern in my audio files, the 43 repetitions, I think it corresponds to the settlers. I think whatever is down there has been counting them, keeping them. The voice I heard doesn't frighten me anymore, and that frightens me more than anything. I keep thinking about the final line in Whitlock's journal, it remembers the names. I think remembering is not passive. I think remembering is how it holds them. I can hear it now even without the recorder. Very faint. Very patient. I think it has always been here, long before 1878, long before the Ozarks had a name. I think it lets people find the story so that someone will always come looking. And I think. Recording ends. 43 seconds of static follow. Then silence. Document 3, fragment of unknown origin. Found folded inside Miriam Cole's jacket recovered at the site. Paper estimated to be approximately 140 years old. Origin unverified. The handwriting matches no known sample. The ink is consistent with late 19th century iron gall composition. The paper itself, however, carried no deterioration whatsoever, as if never exposed to time. To whoever finds this, we did not disappear. We were kept. The earth here is alive in ways your sciences cannot measure and your faith cannot explain. It does not hate. It does not love. It simply remembers. It called us by name, and we answered. Not because we were foolish, but because the voice was kind and we were tired and it promised rest. We have been resting ever since. If you are reading this, it has already learned your name. The wisest thing you can do is leave. The second wisest is to forgive yourself for not leaving. The Harrow Creek Settlers, 1878. Closing note. University Archive Librarian date stamp, March 3, 2027. These documents arrived in a sealed envelope with no return address, no postage. The envelope itself showed no signs of having passed through any postal service. It was simply on my desk one morning. I have filed these materials under restricted access pending faculty review. I have also submitted my resignation, effective immediately. I do not wish to explain why. The hollow of silence remains sealed. The ground continues to hum. And somewhere beneath the Ozark Mountains, 43 names are still being remembered.